You walk through the forest. It is primarily birch trees and some oak. It smells of wet moss and fallen leaves. The sound of birdsong pervades the air, with small animals scampering around. You can almost taste the flowers and young berries on the trees. Underneath, the footing is firm with a few trippy roots.
All right, I'm going to walk through the forest carefully, axe at the ready, keeping an eye out for goblins. 8.
Ah, you checked?
Well, a little more confident. I'm just going to walk through the forest at a normal pace.
Okay then. You notice a goblin sneaking up on you.
What?
Today we'll talk about the 2 types of perception, 2 problems with perception, and 2 solutions to those problems. What's perception? The player's handbook defines it as the ability to spot, hear, or otherwise detect the presence of something. It measures your general awareness of your surroundings and the keenness of your senses, and it's primarily through your wisdom modifier. There are 2 types of perception checks and passive perception. I'll propose a third one closer to the end of this video. Perception checks are your ability to spot, hear, or otherwise detect things. They are a d20 plus your wisdom modifier plus proficiency if you have it for perception. That's what you do when you're actively searching for something. Passive perception is the ability to detect things nearby without really looking for them. This is 10 plus your wisdom modifier plus proficiency if you have it. Think of it as your average ability to notice something if you are constantly looking around, which is a d20 with an average roll of 10. When you attempt to sneak up on a deer, you are making a stealth check against the deer's passive perception. There is no need for the DM to make a counter roll for this check. They would just use the deer's stat block. Your passive perception is what is used when the DM begins to roll dice behind the screen and then says you notice nothing. A perception check is what you do when you walk into a room and start looking for things, such as traps. The DC for how hard it is to find something is what your DM will use against your roll. The player's handbook does say very specifically you need to specify what you're looking for and where you are looking. And this brings us to the first problem. Players often walk into a room and immediately make a perception check. I perception the room, for example. This is terrible role play and specifically goes exactly against how the player's handbook says to use perception. First off, the dungeon master should be giving the players information about the 5 senses. Taste isn't always relevant unless you walk into a room and lick things, which is generally not recommended. The players should then specify what they're looking for and how they're looking. The example the player's handbook says is, I'm going to look for a key by going through the drawers. That would be a perception check. But what if the players are just awful with wisdom? If it's their dump stat, how can they take part in an investigatory campaign? Well, there's a solution to this, and that would be the take 20 rule. This means the character can take a given amount of time set by the dungeon master to search in a way as to get a 20, not natural, on their perception score. The roleplay equivalent is tearing a room apart in a grid-like pattern in order to find a key. This is not so much wisdom as just a base ability to look for things. The second problem is that a perception check can be and will be about half the time lower than passive perception in a way that doesn't really make sense for gameplay. Think of Bear Ian. When a goblin narrowly succeeded in beating his perception check with a low hiding score, Ian walked away. But when the goblin scored a higher stealth check against Ian's passive perception, he was spotted. This suggests that Ian was worse at actively searching than he was at not looking at all. For any wisdom score and proficiency, a player will roll 10 or lower about half the time, meaning half of the active perception checks a character makes will be lower than passive perception. Essentially, when you are actively looking for something, you are, on average, as good as when you're not really looking at all. The solution I'm proposing here is what I would call active perception. This is when you search above and beyond your passive perception in a way that specifically augments it. Look at the travel section of the player's handbook on page 182. It discusses penalties to perception when traveling fast. Alternately, taking the time to actively keep an eye out for something that you would detect with passive perception, threats, scenery, would mean slower travel, but would give you a higher score. Think of it as if you're walking through the woods after watching a slasher movie, keeping an eye out specifically for slashers. You're going to be more cautious, and I think you'll notice them more often than they would normally sneak up on you. The game mechanic for this would just be you take the modifier for passive check, so your wisdom plus proficiency if you got it, and you double it. So it's 10 plus wisdom, and then maybe plus proficiency plus proficiency. The player would very much need to indicate what they're listening for, what they're looking for, and how they're doing so, and the DM would set a penalty. If you're looking for goblins, you might not notice berries or traps. If you're looking for traps, you might not notice berries or goblins. And if you're just walking through the forest looking for berries, you're not noticing goblins or traps. Of course, for the DM running a high stealth campaign, this could make sneaking up on an NPC much more difficult if they're actively watching out for intruders. Thus, like any rule change, this should be a table discussion.